So what kind of strategy do you have, Jeff?
Okay, so first of all, we have to have a clear message. And in so many respects, I agree with Bernie Sanders and what he's putting out there. The one area that I strongly disagree with him is the issue of international involvement, and particularly the Syria issue. I have more of an internationalist approach. But we have to have a clear message, and I think the message is out there. And I think Bernie Sanders is not going to get the Democratic nomination, but he's put together a very solid political machine. And I've always looked at this campaign as a contingency plan. And the first contingency...
As your campaign or Bernie's?
My campaign.
Your campaign.
And the first contingency that we have to deal with is that the Bernie Sanders campaign loses the Democratic primaries. And right now, barring anything miraculous, that's what's going to happen. You look at progressive political movements that we've seen in the last few years. We look at the Occupy movement, and then you look at Bernie Sanders' campaign for presidency. You know, the big problem with the Occupy movement was that it was a great message and a great idea, but there was no real political objectives to it. And you look at the Bernie Sanders campaign, those same ideas found expression in a clear objective, but the problem was Bernie Sanders chose to make his fight in the one section of American government that is the most in need of reform, and that's the political parties. The second contingency, and this is something that I've wrestled with personally because it's an uncomfortable thing, is that we are locked into a global conflict. If it were up to me, I would do everything in my power to prevent this. Unfortunately, what we're seeing from all the global players, particularly President Obama, the one thing that we can hope to control on this side, particularly from the Obama administration, is we're seeing sort of a blind slide down that path to global war. So if I can't change that, then this campaign is a contingency for that. So that's what we're looking at. This is a global fight, and the strategy is pretty simple. What we're going to do is we're going to, first of all, get everybody who has a voice and who understands what we're doing and who is interested in this fight and who sees their point of view reflected in our campaign, working together. So we have two objectives. We're going to knock out the extreme of tyranny on the public side, which is authoritarian government, by taking out Assad. If we can do that, if we can take out Assad, that eliminates, that's the keystone issue that is animating a lot of what this global conflict is about. By getting rid of Assad, we knock down the main unifying factor that the tyrants that we're up against, the authoritarian tyrants we're up against, are using. And it's not going to be an instant victory, and it's not going to mean that everything's going to be solved by any means, but it's the first step. The second step is we get the majority of Americans who feel that they are not represented by the Republican and the Democratic Party to take the presidency. And that's what this campaign is.
What would you say to people in this country, and a lot of them are probably have been aligned with the Sanders campaign, but there are people who are anti-war in a lot of different camps. And, they say, well, America, as you say, has all of these problems with its, its election system, with this corruption. How would getting involved in a conflict like this, getting involved in a global conflict, how would that be able to change the problems that we have here? Why should we look outward instead of inward?
America, traditionally, if you look at our position before every great war, if you look at before World War I and World War II, we were both essentially in the same position, that we didn't want to get involved in global conflict, and there was a very strong anti-war movement within the U.S., which is very similar to where we're at right now. We were always reluctant to get in those wars. And I think when this conflict hits home and it becomes apparent that we are, in fact, in the middle of a war, it's going to be much easier to communicate the urgency of this to people on the anti-war side. I am not by any means a pro-war person. I have always felt that diplomacy was the best option. unfortunately, particularly with Syria, particularly with dealing with Putin in Russia right now, is they figured out how to game the diplomatic process for their own agenda. We live in a global society, whether we choose to recognize it or not. And one of the big problems that we're seeing right now is that we're outgrowing the age of nation states. We're outgrowing the level of society where we're nations and we're tribes against each other, and we're entering into an era of human history where we truly are a global humanity. And the problem is we don't have global institutions strong enough to ensure that there's justice and that there's fairness and that there's human rights and that there's peace for everybody equally around the globe. So we have opportunists that are taking advantage of the holes in the system, and that's what's creating this sort of lopsided inequity. And this lopsided inequity is behind so many of the problems that we consider to be domestic problems. They're really not domestic problems. The corruption of the financial system is a global problem. Yes, the American economy is a big chunk of the global economy, but our percentage of the pie is shrinking every year as other countries get stronger. The amount of influence that we can assert in the global financial system by focusing on America alone is getting smaller and smaller every day. The problems that we're facing of losing our civil rights, of not having a job future for so many Americans. Again, these have to do with global issues. And yes, certainly there's a lot that we can do in this country, particularly in the federal government, to help the American people. But in the long run, this is a global challenge and this is a global fight. And if we do everything humanly possible to reform the federal government, to reform state and local government in the United States, so that we have this system of justice and fairness, it's not going to be enough. We are going to be overwhelmed by the global problems, by the global inequity, by corruption, by the threat of climate change. So we have to work together. This has to be a global solution. And America has always held a special place in world history. And I've traveled around the world enough, and I know that when you talk to people, even if people are skeptical of the American government, or of some of the things that America has done in its history, there is this idea behind America, this idealism of everybody being created equal. And what we have to do as Americans is not only do we have to make sure that everybody in this country is getting equal rights and equal protection and equal opportunities as much as possible, we have to make sure that the same standard we apply to each other as Americans applies to everybody around the world. If we can live up to that ideal, then America can truly be a global leader again.
You talk about knocking out Assad. You talk about that. How do you go from there to this vision of more human rights, of a better America? How do you get from point A to point Z?
When we look at the situation globally, what we see is we see more and more countries slipping into authoritarian rule, and we see a lack of security disrupting the problem. So what we have to do, the first phase is we have to interrupt that process. We have to interrupt the slide towards tyranny. And the way that we do that, that's open and available to us, is by knocking out the certainty of Iran and Russia and some of the other dictators being able to back or depend on a bloody tyrant like Assad. We have to reestablish that the international community is going to act in the people, in the best interest of people. We have to reestablish something that President Obama has abandoned, which is the right of the global society to protect people. Not the right to protect, the responsibility to protect. We have to get that back. And by going after Assad, that does that. And that puts the factions that are making bloody dictators like Assad on notice. It certainly doesn't take them out of power, but it gives us a window to deal with that problem and the recognition that we can deal with these tyrants as internationally. We have to get that precedent back. And then on the other side, we want to disrupt the corrupt election process in this country. We want to root out that corruption, but we don't want to destroy American government. We don't want to take out the free market economy. We don't want to destroy or completely disable the federal government, because when we do that, all we're doing is we're creating chaos and we're creating a power vacuum. And if you look at places around the world that have completely lost control of their economy, like Zimbabwe, or we look at places like Somalia that have gone without a government, without a functioning government, that's not a path where something automatically takes place and is rebuilt. So we don't want to destroy those institutions. And that's where having this third party come together in a very quick way, because it has to be quick, because we're up against the corruption that we're seeing at every level of government, and we're also up against vast sums of money that can be thrown against anything. So we have to do it quickly. We have to do this almost like a guerrilla style political campaign. And if we can do that, if we can win this election, we can disrupt the system. It's not an automatic change, but it's enough of a disruption that people are going to entertain other possibilities, and that we might have a chance to really reform not only our election system, but the way America interacts with the world. So these first two steps, these are the vital first two steps, but by no means are they the end. And basically the way that I see it is then we have 4 years to really turn the ship around. What we're doing, if we're successful at this, and of course we have to be honest, this is an extreme long shot. But the fact that it's a long shot in and of itself means that if we're successful, everybody is going to stop and take notice of what we're doing. Now, we also have to make sure that the faction that we're putting together, the political, has the integrity to carry through with the necessary reforms. And again, that's where the modern media and everything comes together. I believe that we can build a more immediately responsive political force. Something that responds more quickly and more realistically to people and to the needs of the people, but it has to be something different. Here's the analogy. We don't want to take out the hardware of American government, and we don't want to take out the operating software, which we could look at as our society, as American society, or as our American system of government. What we're going to do is it's almost like installing a patch to the software on your computer, where you have what's called a soft reboot, where you install the patch and then your computer tells you, okay, we're going to shut down for a moment and restart.
Okay.
And we're going to restart the system. And this patch isn't going to change everything instantly, but it fixes the immediate problems. And it keeps the system going so that what does work in American society, what does work in an American government, can be put to use to making the changes necessary. Even though I consider myself to be a progressive candidate and that I have progressive views, we have common allies of people who identify themselves as Republican, or people who identify more strongly with the Republican Party. You know, the reason that Donald Trump was able to rise like he has is in no small part due to the fact that very sensible people realize that they're not being represented by the system. The one advantage that we have is we know what we're going to get with President Clinton. We're going to have the same exact fights that we have today. And we know what the worst case scenario is with the President Trump, which is a complete disintegration of the entire system. So this is the only opportunity that we have. And this has to be decided by the American people, because we're talking about the fate of the country itself. But ultimately, what the American people choose is going to have a huge impact, if not perhaps the most important impact at this juncture in history on the way that the rest of the world goes.
So why, why should somebody support you?
This really comes down to a leap of faith. First of all, that people recognize that what I'm offering is a vision that can come true. It starts with that vision. And then from that vision, it goes to trying to beat that very human tendency to always be looking backwards, to always looking at the past, and to look where we're at in the present, and to see what kind of coalition and what we can build up in the next 6 months. If we can build up a system together, then whatever my strengths and my failings are as an individual shouldn't matter as much as the system that we can build together. But again, it takes a leap of faith. And I wish that I had one great all-purpose answer of why come November you should vote for Jeff George, but I don't. All I can say is let's work on this. Let's take this vision. Let's see what we can do. If there's a chance that we can be successful, then for the sake of humanity, we have to start doing this now. We have to get out there and we have to get ourselves engaged in this fight. And then what it's going to come down to, am I the man who can do it, is going to be decided in November. You know, one of the reasons that I want to run as a write-in candidate, it's not because it's the only option I have available, because I want this choice to be an act of conscience from the American people. I want them to decide for themselves and to be absolutely clear in that decision that they are breaking the mold of what's been offered before and that they're taking a chance on me as it stands right now, and by November it'll be an us.